My name is Patrick Ebel. I'm a Junior Research Group leader at ScaDS.AI at the Center for Scalable Data Analytics and AI at Leipzig University. And I'm very happy today to give this Living Lab lecture and tell you a little bit more about computational user modeling and the vision that me and my group that we are after and how we think that simulated users and in particular computational models can help to design better technology. Interactive technology is everywhere. If you think of how much time you spend of your day interacting with a smartphone or a laptop, the importance of good technology becomes very, very clear. In the future, this technology will become much more intelligent and influential. One example are automated cars, like this Waymo here in San Francisco. Interactive technology evolves fast and becomes more and more intelligent. In this sense, user-centered design, so designing with the user in mind, becomes more and more important. But what is the problem with user-centered design in its current state? I am arguing that HCI relies too much on experimental studies, and therefore user-centered design can be seen as glorified trial and error. What do I mean by that? If we take a look on the user-centered design lifecycle, we first start with ideation and prototyping. Here, we generate first prototypes or user interfaces. However, to see whether or not these user interfaces are any good, we need to test them. And how is it currently done? We run lab experiments. So this is me on the girls' day, that's why there's a child in the car. But let's assume we have a new UI prototype for automated driving. We present this to many different participants and we run those lab experiments. So we need to invite participants, we need to design a study, we need to have multiple days in which we do this. We then get test results. Test results meaning we know how good do people actually interact with our interface while driving the car. Based on these test results, we then move towards a new ideation prototyping phase because we need to adjust our interfaces based on our test results with humans. So in theory, we need to do this all over and over and over again. And if you think about it, this becomes very, very expensive because you need to invite people, you need to design studies, you need to analyze it again. Thus, if you look at the asterisks I made, I'm arguing that user-centered design is glorified trial and error if we don't leverage modeling and simulation. So what if HCI would leverage simulations? To do so, or to get an idea of how this could look like, we can take a look at other disciplines. For example, in mechanical engineering. This is actually a screenshot of my own bachelor thesis. Here, FEM simulations are run to predict the load that a structure can bear, for example. We can take a look at fluid dynamics, at aerodynamics, for example, in Formula 1, or even in electronics, where simulations are run before first chip design is sent to production. If we take a look here, we see that simulations are used for prediction, for evaluation, for design optimization, for general design insights, for inference about how certain things might behave, and even for theory building. However, if you think about HCI, why aren't computational models used here as much? The answer to this is that human behavior is very complex. Our behavior, and especially how we interact with technology, is shaped by our motivation, by our abilities, and by the task environment. What do I mean by that? If we take a look, for example, at this person interacting with her smartphone while driving in a bus, we need to consider, to describe this interaction on the smartphone, that what are the cognitive boundaries? So what is the goal of this person? What does she want to achieve? What is her memory capability? How long can we remember certain things that we did? We need to also consider our perceptual bounds. So for example, we need to sample the environment and our smartphone, so we need to switch around our visual focus. Also proprioception, so where are my hands, where are my legs? We also need to consider motor abilities, so I can't move my arm infinitively fast. And I also have sensomotory abilities. So for example, I can feel the difference between the smartphone screen and another texture, for example. However, we also need to consider the environment, in particular here, the context in which the interaction appears, because it's completely different whether or not I'm interacting at home on my couch or in this bus while standing. And the design, because I can only do certain interactions that the design of the UI allows me to do. So if we think about it, we see that it's very, very complex. So now I want to rewind a bit and go back to take a look at the very early computational models in human-computer interaction. And here the first model we can think about is Fitts law. So Fitts law is considered with the task of predicting pointing times. What do we mean by that? If we think about this tablet, for example, and we want to predict how long a certain interaction takes, this is exactly what Fitts law does. So we see this is a typing interaction, and if we think about what might this action depend on, how fast we interact here is on the one hand dependent on the distance between the 2 points of interactions and the width. And this is exactly what Paul Fitts put into his first model of HCI, or his mathematical formula. How did he do this? He basically conducted a task where he asked people to do pointing actions between 2 targets. So they always started with this electrical pen there and needed to move to the new target. And he was varying the target width, so how big this strip was, and the distance between the 2 targets. He did this for 4 distances and 4 width, from 2 to 16 inch and 0.25 to 2 inch in the width. He then collected these different movement times, and here we can already see that with an increasing distance, the interaction time increases, but with an increase in width of the target, the interaction time decreases. What he did do is he put this into the formula of movement time, and he found that the movement time is dependent on the distance divided by the width. He had 2 parameters that describe the target, the user, and the task itself, and he found that there is a logarithmic relationship between the distance and the width for the movement time. So I won't go into further detail, but this is one of the earliest models with which it was possible to predict movement times. Another interesting model are the GOMS models. GOMS models are models, information theoretic processor models that are used to model interactions with complex dialogue tasks. So they are based on the theory of cognitive skills and grounded in an information processing framework. So one can say that they assume discrete perceptual, cognitive, and motor processes working on sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. And this is also what you could see in this funny picture. So you would, for example, see that there's a perceptual processor near the eye. GOMS is basically based on 4 components, which is goals, so the goal that the user wants to achieve. Operators, which are basic perceptual, cognitive, or motor actions, which you see on the picture. These actions are associated with certain times. We have different methods, so you can reach one goal via different steps. For example, if you think about saving a PDF, you could do it with a short key or via the menu and a save as kind of path. And there are selection rules which basically define how users choose among competing methods. If we go back to our PDF example, we could say that, for example, if both hands are on the keyboard, use the shortcut. If one hand is on the mouse, go via the menu. So what does GOMS do? According to these operator times, we can predict task completion times for a complex or way more complex task than Fitts law would allow alone. And we can predict error rates and error recoveries. Error recoveries are basically done via the same format. So with this, you have an early idea of how these models look like. If you think about GOMS, for example, or KLM, what you would need to do is you would need to specify for one task all the different steps and piece them together. And this is where we come to the critiques on these traditional approaches. They are very hard to build, so you need to have expertise. So you need to know, okay, what are the task parameters, how long does a certain action take, and how do I need to piece them together. Furthermore, these somewhat rule-based system or processor-based systems, they quickly grow very, very large. So the more complex the task gets, the more different connections you have. They're also very hard to adapt, and they do not adapt to changing task or environment conditions. And they lack embodiment. There is no true interaction with the environment. They lack natural language. There's no understanding of natural language here. Fitting model parameters can be a pain. So if you need to know, okay, a pointing operator takes this long, but you have no empirical evidence for this, you need to invite participants to to define these model parameters and fit them. And these models cannot run in software simulations, for example. So if we think about it, there are a lot of reasons why these traditional models are not really used in technology design at the moment. And the question that we are asking with our group is, how can simulation become fundamental to how we design interactive technology? So how do we want to accomplish that? What is the vision in our group? In our research, we develop simulated users based on the theory of computational rationality that on the one hand serve as interactive crash test dummies to make user-centered design more efficient, and on the other hand serve as models of human thought and behavior to align intelligent technology with human goals. To explain what this means, we need to take a further look into what computational rationality actually is. To do so, we want to dive into the theoretical assumptions behind computational rationality. So what are those? First one is that we as humans, we learn from experience. We learn from interacting with our environment and updating our beliefs and policies on how to interact with it via these experiences that we make. We also know that human behavior is bounded. What does that mean? It means on the one hand that human behavior is bounded internally. So we have cognitive boundaries, as in we cannot think infinitively fast. We have motor boundaries defined by our physiology, and we have perceptual constraints, meaning that, for example, we as humans, since we have foveated and peripheral vision, we need to actively sample our environment to recognize structures, for example. On the other hand, our behaviors are also externally bounded. They are externally bounded by the environment or by the design, for example. So I can only do a certain interaction in a user interface that the user interface admits as well. And what the interesting thing is about computational rationality is that it postulates that humans choose their behavior to maximize expected utility. What does it mean in layman's terms? It means that people do what is best for them, given what they can do. And if we take a look at these two circles, we see that there is a union between the behaviors that are admitted by the internal environment and the behaviors that are admitted by the external environment. And somewhere in between there is what we call the subjective utility payoff surface. This is where we reach our goals to a certain degree, we as humans. And somewhere in there is a boundedly optimal strategy that, given the bounds, this is the best behavior that a human can do to reach their goals. And the nice thing is, if we formulate it like this, human behavior, we can formulate it as a partially observable Markov decision process. And this, on the other hand, allows us again to approximate behavior policies, so approximate human behavior via reinforcement learning. And by that, we can get verifiable predictions of user interaction behavior. So let's dive a little bit into reinforcement learning. You may already know this traditional reinforcement learning approach where you have an agent that interacts with an external environment. Based on the action it takes, it gets and the external environment jumps into a new state and the agent gets a reward for its interaction. So how does this translate to computational rationality? The idea is very simple, that instead of the external environment, the agent interacts with an internal environment, which is basically, you can see it as the body, for example, of the agent. So the agent says, move your arm here. So muscle activations are triggered and the internal environment sends a response to the external environment, where a stimulus, for example, a change in the environment that we then see via or observe via our eyes. And this observation is then sent to the agent that again receives a reward from the internal environment and performs a new action. To make it a little bit more obvious, we can take a look at our example from the person interacting in the bus again. You see that the internal environment is described by the cognitive bounds, the perceptual bound, and the motor bounds. And the external environment, again, is the design on the smartphone, for example, or the environment stating that the person is driving in a bus. So how does this and computational rationality go towards simulated users? We use computational rationality as an integrated theory of cognition, perception, and biomechanics to build this, what I call simulated users. So let's see how we envision to use them. Let's assume we have a design problem or design specification. We have a design prototype. And what you would normally do, we saw it in my introduction, is that you would run a very expensive study with many users to update this design prototype. However, we would replace these studies or the participants with simulated users. And how would this look like? The simulated user would perceive the design prototype because we implement models of human vision or proprioception. This information is then processed via models of cognition that model, for example, human memory, human decision-making, human planning, or reasoning. And based on the cognition, the simulated user would perform motor actions. These motor actions could be, for example, biomechanical models for controlling movement via muscle activations, which we see here. These models then interact with the design prototype. The prototype, of course, when you receive a touch interaction, jumps to a new state that is then again perceived by the simulated user. And the nice thing about this is that we don't need to invite many participants anymore, but we can run these evaluations with our simulated users, and we can adjust the simulated users to fit different personas. And what this allows us to do is that we can run what-if simulations with different designs, tasks, and simulated users. So we can interchange all of the different parts and just run a new simulation. So a new evaluation is only a click away and not a big user study away. What is an example of such a simulated user? Here, for example, we did it with Atari. So we have an external environment, which is basically the Atari game. We programmed an internal environment, a model that has motor control, memory, and perception. And this observes the external environment via sensory stimuli. You see the observation on the bottom left. This is basically simulating foveated vision, so we can only perceive the area that is in focus. We cannot focus on the whole game. This is then, the observation is then brought to the policy decides on an action, and then a motor action and a sensory action is considered. Where did this lead to? In the end, we can generate saliency maps, for example. So on top you see human saliency map from a human study, and on the bottom you see where in this image or where in this game our agent focuses on. And we see that we have already some kind of overlay, so we can simulate human saliency here. And here I give another example of how we can model motor control or motor boundaries. In this work, we learn muscle activations to reconstruct or synthesize biomechanical plausible motion from device logs. So the idea is that given a device log saying a certain person interacted on the XY coordinates, our system can reconstruct the motion that would have been necessary to perform these interactions on a smartphone. And we do this by integrating Android emulator in a physics simulator in which we can run a biomechanical modeling. And this looks like this, that based on the coordinates that we see, our model then performs interactions on a smartphone. And this is basically the same way that humans learn muscle activation. Our model via reinforcement learning also learns muscle activations. So you can see that it can perform all of these interactions and can also perform various different tasks that involve pointing, for example, or swiping. Yeah. That's it. I want to thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy that I could give this lecture. I hope everybody learned a little bit more about computational models and in particular about simulated users and our vision on how we can use these models to improve technology. And I'm happy to answer your questions now. Thank you.